Welcome to Through Time Tales, where history stumbles and logic fails. Before we begin, like and subscribe if you like strange old stories. Once upon a time, the world was a very superstitious place, and by once, I mean for most of recorded history. Before the age of science, antibiotics, and decent plumbing, strange events needed explanations, so naturally people blamed witches, because of course if your crops failed, it clearly wasn't due to soil conditions, but probably because Margaret from 2 huts down gave them the evil eye. The concept of the witch predates Christianity, but the medieval church made it fashionable to panic about them. In the early Middle Ages, the church didn't really think witches existed. They thought anyone claiming to do magic was just a delusional heretic. But by the 13th century, things took a dramatic turn, thanks in part to inquisitors, political instability, and a growing fondness for setting people on fire. In 1487, 2 German gentlemen published a book called Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches. It was essentially a medieval DIY manual for witch hunters. It explained in great detail how to identify, interrogate, and execute witches. It also strongly implied that most witches were women, because obviously. The book was wildly popular, second only to the Bible in sales, which tells you a lot about the reading interests of 15th century Europeans. Soon witches were everywhere, or rather, people believed they were, and then they began to act accordingly. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe. And that's just the ones we can confirm. Most of them were women. Why women? Because society at the time thought women were naturally weaker, more sinful, and more prone to consorting with the devil. Also because it's much easier to blame someone who can't fight back. Common targets included widows, midwives, herbalists, and anyone who talked to their cat too much. Trials were not exactly fair. The accused were tortured until they confessed, and then executed for confessing. If they didn't confess, they were tortured more. It was, legally speaking, a bit of a trap. One popular method was the swimming test. The accused would be thrown into a body of water. If they floated, they were a witch. If they sank, they were innocent, but also dead. So really, there were no winners. Many witch trials were driven by local feuds, land disputes, or just pure spite. If your neighbor annoyed you, all you had to do was whisper, "I saw her dancing with Satan," and then sit back and enjoy the show. The worst of it occurred in Germany, Switzerland, France, and Scotland. In Würzburg and Bamberg, entire towns were swept up in mass purges. Children, clergy, and even mayors were accused and burned, because nothing says civic stability like barbecuing your local government. Now we arrive in the new world, because of course witch hysteria needed a colonial reboot. In 1692, the town of Salem, Massachusetts, made its mark on history in the least flattering way possible. It all began with 2 young girls, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams. They started having fits, screaming, throwing things, and generally behaving like they were auditioning for a horror film. The local doctor couldn't find a medical explanation, so he settled on the next best thing. Witchcraft, naturally. Under pressure, the girls began to name names. They accused 3 women, a slave named Tituba, a homeless woman named Sarah Good, and a poor old lady named Sarah Osborne. Tituba, after being beaten, confessed. She spun a tale of witches flying on poles and signing the devil's book. This went down a treat, and the accusation snowballed. Within months, dozens were arrested, courts were set up, and people started dying, and now we arrive at the particularly bleak part, the story of Ann Putnam Jr., age 12. She was one of the so-called afflicted girls of Salem. Over the course of the trials, she accused 62 people of witchcraft, including her neighbors, her pastor's wife, and most notably, her own mother's friends. But the most tragic of all may be the case of Sarah Carrier, a young girl who testified against her own mother, Martha Carrier. Martha had a reputation for being loud, opinionated, and bad-tempered, which, in Puritan society, was enough to qualify as probably a witch. During her trial, her children were brought in to testify, including 7-year-old Sarah. Under intense pressure and likely coercion, she stated her mother made her sign the devil's book and claimed her mother could turn into a cat, which, if true, would have been impressive. But of course it wasn't. Martha Carrier was found guilty and hanged in August 1692. Years later, Sarah expressed deep regret, as did Ann Putnam Jr., who issued a public apology in 1706. She stated that she had been deluded by Satan, which in fairness was probably more accurate than the original testimony. By the end of 1692, even Puritans began to realize the trials had gone too far. Governor William Phips shut it all down after his own wife was accused, because apparently mass hysteria is fine until it comes for your own family. In total, 20 people were executed and hundreds imprisoned. Many later received apologies and financial compensation, though I'm sure the deceased found that terribly helpful. In Europe, witch trials gradually died out in the 18th century. This was thanks to the Enlightenment, scientific reasoning, and people finally questioning whether old Agnes really could summon hailstorms with her eyebrows. In 1736, Britain repealed its witchcraft laws. By then, most people had moved on to more modern forms of scapegoating. Today, we look back on witch hunts with a mix of horror and disbelief. But the mechanics, panic, blame, misinformation are still very much alive, only the names have changed. So, what have we learned? First, that fear is a powerful thing. Second, that people will believe almost anything if it makes them feel in control. And third, that history is often just one long list of really bad ideas executed with great enthusiasm. The witch hunts were not about witches. They were about power, fear, and the human need to make sense of a chaotic world. Thousands of women and men died not because they were magical, but because someone else said they were, often a child or a neighbor. In the end, the only real magic here is how long it took us to stop, and how easily it could happen again. Thank you for watching. Please remember not to accuse your neighbors of witchcraft, even if they own more than one cat. Good night.